Some places are not abandoned, they are forgotten. High in the mountains, far from the noise of cities and the constant motion of modern life, there are places where time seems to have stopped. Villages where doors remain half open, where stone houses slowly collapse under snow and wind, where empty streets echo with a silence that feels almost unnatural. These places were once full of life. Children running through narrow paths, farmers waking before sunrise, church bells or mosque calls echoing through the valleys, smoke rising from chimneys during long winter nights. But today many of these villages are gone. Not destroyed, not erased, simply forgotten. Across mountain ranges around the world, from the Alps to the Caucasus, from the Andes to remote villages in Anatolia, entire communities once lived in isolation, shaped by harsh landscapes and long winters. And then, slowly, they disappeared. Some left for better opportunities in cities. Some were forced to move after natural disasters. Some villages were emptied by war, disease, or economic collapse. But what they left behind is something far more powerful than ruins. They left behind stories. Stories whispered by abandoned houses, old paths, and forgotten cemeteries. Stories that modern maps rarely show. This is forgotten mountain villages, the silent stories they left behind. And sometimes, when people return to these places decades later, they discover something strange. The village may be empty, but the past never truly left. The life that once filled these mountains. To understand the silence of these abandoned villages, you first have to imagine what life once looked like there. Mountain villages were rarely easy places to live. Winters were long and brutal. Roads could disappear under heavy snow for months. Supplies were limited, and the distance from larger towns meant people had to rely on each other for survival. But isolation also created something unique. Communities in mountain villages were often incredibly close. Families knew each other for generations. Traditions were preserved more strongly than in cities. Old songs, dialects, crafts, and customs passed from grandparents to children almost unchanged. Life moved slower. Seasons mattered. Spring meant planting. Summer meant gathering food and preparing for the winter. Autumn meant storing supplies. And winter meant survival. But despite the hardship, many people who grew up in these villages later described their childhood as something special, because these were places where nature shaped every part of daily life. The mountains were not just scenery. They were protection, isolation, danger, and identity all at once. Yet over time, something changed. And slowly, these communities began to fade. Why so many mountain villages disappeared? The disappearance of mountain villages did not happen all at once. It happened quietly, over decades. In many cases, the first change came with roads. When transportation improved, younger generations suddenly had access to cities, education, and new opportunities. And once people left the mountains for the cities, many never returned. Modern life offered things these remote villages could not. Hospitals, schools, jobs, electricity, communication. Little by little, families moved away. A house became empty, then another, then another. Eventually the school closed. The small village store shut down. And once a village loses its services, the remaining residents often follow, because life becomes too difficult to sustain. But not every village disappeared for the same reason. Some were abandoned after earthquakes or landslides. Some lost their population during wars. Others simply became too remote in a rapidly modernizing world. And once a village empties completely, something unusual happens. Nature begins to reclaim it. When nature takes back the village, abandoned mountain villages rarely stay unchanged. Without people maintaining them, buildings slowly deteriorate. Roofs collapse under snow. Wooden structures rot. Stone walls crumble. Paths disappear beneath grass and trees. Within a few decades, an entire village can start blending back into the mountain landscape. Wild animals move in. Foxes, wolves, and birds begin using empty houses as shelter. Plants grow through windows and cracked walls. And slowly, the boundary between civilization and wilderness disappears. But sometimes, despite this transformation, signs of the past remain eerily intact. A rusted farming tool leaning against a wall. Old photographs inside broken houses. handwritten notes, children's toys, clothing left behind decades earlier. It is these details that make abandoned villages feel so powerful, because they remind us that these were not ruins built for tourists. They were homes, places where people laughed, argued, celebrated, and struggled. Places where entire lives unfolded, and then, somehow, those lives moved on, leaving only the silent architecture behind. The stories people still tell, even after villages are abandoned, the surrounding regions rarely forget them completely. Older generations often remember the people who once lived there. They remember festivals, weddings, harvest seasons, and harsh winters. But they also remember something else. Strange stories. Stories about light seen in empty houses, footsteps heard on abandoned paths, or voices carried through mountain winds. In many cases, these stories are simply reflections of memory, human imagination filling the silence left by the past. But mountain regions have always been places where folklore grows easily. Isolation, darkness, and vast landscapes create the perfect environment for legends. Some villages gain reputations as haunted places. Others become local mysteries. And sometimes the stories are not about ghosts at all, but about the last families who refused to leave. People who stayed until the very end. Guardians of places that the rest of the world had already forgotten. Why these villages still matter. At first glance, abandoned mountain villages may look like nothing more than ruins. Old houses, broken walls, empty roads, but they represent something much larger. They are reminders of how quickly the world can change. Just one generation can transform a thriving community into a silent landscape, and with each abandoned village, something else disappears too. Dialects vanish, traditional crafts fade away, local histories are forgotten, ways of life that existed for centuries suddenly end. In many parts of the world, researchers and historians are now trying to document these villages before they disappear completely. Photographing buildings, recording stories, mapping locations. Because once the last memories fade, these places risk becoming invisible to history itself. Yet the mountains remember. The houses remain. The paths still lead somewhere. And sometimes, when travelers stumble upon these forgotten villages, they feel something difficult to explain. A sense that the silence is not empty, but full of lives that once filled these mountains. In part 1, we explored the quiet disappearance of mountain villages and the lives that once shaped them. We saw how isolation created strong communities, how modernization slowly pulled people away, and how nature began reclaiming places that once echoed with daily life. But the deeper mystery begins when people return to these abandoned villages, because in part 2, we will explore the strangest stories connected to forgotten mountain settlements. Villages that vanish suddenly, places locals avoid after sunset, and the unsettling discoveries explorers sometimes make when they enter houses that have been empty for decades. Because sometimes, the silence of a forgotten village is not just history. It feels like something waiting to be remembered. When a village disappears, the stories don't. When a mountain village is abandoned, the silence that follows can feel overwhelming. Empty homes, collapsed barns, paths that lead nowhere. But people who return to these forgotten places often say something strange. The silence doesn't feel empty. It feels layered, as if the past is still present in some quiet way. Because long after the last residents leave, stories continue to live in the mountains. Stories about why the village was abandoned. Stories about the final families who stayed. And sometimes, stories about things that no one can fully explain. In part 2, we explore the strange memories, local legends, and unsettling discoveries that surround many forgotten mountain villages. Because sometimes the ruins hold more than history. They hold unanswered questions. The villages that disappeared too quickly. Most mountain villages faded slowly. Families moved away over decades. Houses gradually emptied. But some villages seem to have disappeared far more suddenly. In certain places around the world, travelers have discovered settlements where it looks like people left in a hurry. Tables still set. Tools still resting where they were last used. Personal belongings scattered throughout empty homes. At first glance, these scenes feel unsettling, but often the explanations are simpler than they appear. Natural disasters. harsh winters, landslides that made the area unsafe, or government relocation programs that forced residents to leave quickly. Still, when visitors walk through these abandoned spaces years later, the feeling can be eerie, because daily life appears frozen in time. A half-finished project, a calendar still hanging on the wall, a child's toy left in the corner of a room. It reminds us how quickly normal life can end. One moment, a village is alive, and the next it becomes a memory. The last people who refused to leave. In many abandoned villages, a few residents stayed long after most others had gone, often elderly, often deeply connected to the land. These last inhabitants sometimes lived alone for years in places that once held dozens of families, without neighbours, without shops, without schools or doctors nearby. Some people stayed because they believed the mountains were their home. Others simply had nowhere else to go. Local stories often remember these final residents with a mix of respect and sadness. They became guardians of places that were slowly disappearing, keeping traditions alive, maintaining houses that would eventually fall silent. In some cases, travelers who visit abandoned villages today still find traces of these last residents. Gardens that continued growing long after most houses were empty. Signs of repairs on certain homes. Small personal details that show someone once fought to keep the village alive. But eventually, even the most stubborn guardians must leave. And when the last person goes, the village truly becomes part of the past. Strange sounds in empty places. Mountains are quiet places, but they are rarely completely silent. Wind moves through broken windows. Wooden beams shift as temperatures change. Animals wander through empty streets. And these natural sounds often create the strange feeling that something is still alive inside abandoned villages. Visitors sometimes report hearing footsteps when no one is there. Doors creaking in the wind. Distant echoes that seem almost like voices. Most of the time, these sounds have simple explanations. Old buildings react to weather. Wind carries sound across long distances. Wild animals move through structures once built for humans. But when people explore these villages alone, surrounded by empty houses and vast mountain landscapes, imagination can easily fill the gaps. And this is where many legends begin. Not from supernatural events, but from the human mind trying to interpret unfamiliar silence. The legends that grow in isolated places, mountain communities, have always been rich with folklore. Isolation naturally encourages storytelling. For generations, people passed down tales about mysterious travelers, hidden treasures, protective spirits, or cursed places. When a village becomes abandoned, these stories often grow stronger. A strange light seen in a ruined house. A shadow moving between empty buildings. A path locals refuse to walk after sunset. Over time, small stories become legends, and legends become part of the identity of the place itself. In reality, many of these tales simply reflect the human need to explain the unknown. When we encounter places where life suddenly stops, our imagination searches for meaning. But sometimes the real stories behind these villages are already powerful enough. War, migration, economic collapse, natural disasters. Each abandoned village carries a history that shaped its disappearance, and those histories are often more haunting than any legend. Why explorers keep searching for these places. Despite the silence, forgotten mountain villages continue to attract travelers, historians, and explorers, not because they expect to find something supernatural, but because these places offer a rare glimpse into the past. A moment frozen in time. Walking through an abandoned village can feel like stepping into a photograph. The architecture reflects a different era. Tools and objects reveal how people once lived. Even the layout of the village tells a story about survival in a harsh landscape. For historians, these sites are valuable cultural records. For photographers, they capture a powerful visual contrast between nature and human history. And for ordinary travelers, they offer something deeper. A reminder that communities, traditions, and ways of life can disappear surprisingly quickly. The mountains keep the memory, even when the world forgets. The quiet lesson of abandoned villages. Perhaps the most powerful thing about forgotten mountain villages is not mystery or legend. It is perspective. These villages remind us that even the most stable communities are temporary. People build homes, raise families, create traditions that last for generations. But time, technology, and history eventually reshape everything. A thriving village today may be empty tomorrow, and places that once felt like the center of the world can slowly fade from memory. Yet these abandoned villages are not truly meaningless ruins. They are historical footprints, evidence of human resilience in difficult environments, proof that people once built lives in places where survival itself required strength and cooperation. Even in silence, these villages continue telling that story. Final thought the mountains remember. In cities, history is constantly replaced. Old buildings disappear. Streets change. Modern life moves forward quickly. But in the mountains, time behaves differently. Places remain. Paths stay where people once walked. Stone houses endure long after their builders are gone. And sometimes, when travelers stand in the middle of a forgotten mountain village, surrounded by wind and silence, they realize something unusual. The village may be empty, but it is not truly gone. The mountains remember every life that passed through these streets, every family that built these homes, every story that once echoed through these valleys. And perhaps that is why these places feel so powerful, because even when human voices fade, the landscape continues carrying their memory, the stories that still echo through the mountains. In many regions around the world, abandoned mountain villages are not just empty places. They are places with memories, and sometimes those memories survive in the form of stories passed down through generations. One such story comes from a small village high in the mountains of northern Italy. For centuries, the village survived through farming and livestock. Winters were harsh, but the community was strong. Then, during the 1950s, younger residents began leaving for work in the cities. Within 2 decades, nearly every family had moved away. Today the village stands empty. Stone houses still line the narrow paths, their wooden roofs slowly collapsing under years of snow. But locals say something unusual still happens there. Hikers who pass through the village sometimes report hearing distant bells echoing through the valley at sunset. The strange part is that the church bell tower collapsed many years ago. No one lives there now. And yet, when the wind moves through the valley at just the right moment, the mountains seem to carry a sound that reminds people of the life that once filled those streets. Another story comes from a remote mountain settlement in Eastern Europe. This village was abandoned after a landslide destroyed the main road connecting it to nearby towns. Without access to supplies, most families were located within a few years. Today, the village is hidden deep within the forest. Explorers who have visited the area say that walking through the settlement feels like stepping into a forgotten moment of time. Inside one house, an old wooden table still stands near a window. On it rests a faded photograph of a family taken decades ago. Dust covers the frame, but the image remains clear. 3 children standing beside their parents, smiling, frozen forever in a place that no longer exists as a living community. Moments like these are what make abandoned villages feel so powerful, because they remind us that history is not just made of large events. It is made of ordinary lives. Perhaps the most haunting story comes from a mountain village in the Caucasus region. Locals say that the last resident of the village was an elderly man who refused to leave even after everyone else had moved away. For years he lived there alone, tending a small garden and caring for the abandoned houses. Travelers passing through the mountains would sometimes see smoke rising from his chimney during winter. He stayed longer than anyone expected, but eventually, even he disappeared. No one knows exactly when. Today the village remains empty, yet sometimes hikers say they find small signs that someone once cared deeply for that place. A repaired fence, a cleared path, a garden that once grew vegetables in the middle of a silent village. Stories like these remind us that abandoned villages are not just ruins. They are places where human lives unfolded, where people built homes, raised children, shared meals, and faced the harsh beauty of mountain life together. And even after those people are gone, their stories continue to echo quietly through the mountains. Thanks for watching Forgotten Mountain Villages, the silent stories they left behind. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And tell us in the comments, would you explore an abandoned mountain village if you had the chance? Because somewhere in the mountains right now, there may still be villages waiting quietly to be rediscovered.